My name is Susan Cooke, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for this panel. I learned a tremendous amount by reading the summaries, and I think that you too will find it very interesting. We often use the term body of work in discussing the products of an artist. Body as in the sense of a literal sort of connection with the artist's body, and also as bodies, objects that exist in and out of the world and have a form of agency, as does the artist. And those objects can extend the artist's influence. They can, in some ways, pervert the artist's influence or corrupt it in some sense or falsify it. They can also be the vessels by which the artist's aspirations and creative imagination are most fully realized. The papers on this session span the 17th century to the 21st century, and I think they each take a rather interesting angle on that idea of objects, replicas, as extensions of the artist's existence out into the world and the impact they have, some anticipated and some not. Our first panelist is Hannah Kenney. She is a college lecturer in art history at Christ Church College, Oxford. She has just submitted her dissertation on Giambologna. And this project explores how the Florentine bronze sculptors working after Giambologna's death in 1608 elaborated his designs and techniques to their own ends. She received her MA from the Bard Graduate Center in New York, and portions of the research that she's talking about today will appear in an edited volume on faithful copies later this year. She is also published on Grand Tour guidebook descriptions of the relationship between antique sculptures and their early modern copies.
So thank you to the organizers of this conference and for the chance to talk about this topic, which I've thought a lot about in the past couple of years. In 1687, Ferdinando Tacca, sculptor and engineer of Cosimo III, Grand Duke of Tuscany, died. Shortly after his death, two representatives of the Grand Duke entered into Tacca's living quarters and studio to repossess it and its contents for the Grand Duke and his heirs. The building was, as the document that records the act of repossession describes, a house in Florence in the parish of San Piero Maggiore on the street called Pinti, with a large fabbrica and a furnace for casting bronze statues, a portico, and a large stone door. The palazzo had been purchased by the sculptor Giambologna 100 years earlier in 1587. As I will discuss in this paper, when the sculptor died in 1608, he willed the property as well as the contents of his studio to his nephew. In the same will, he also entitled his artistic heir, Pietro Tacca, to continue to live and work in the complex and to have access to his small-scale sculptural models. Pietro Tacca utilized the Borgo Pinti studio until his death in 1640, when his son Ferdinando succeeded him. The building that the Grand Duke's agent entered that day in 1687 then was not just Ferdinando's private living and working space, but, as I will discuss, it was also the storehouse for the models of his predecessors. As the document reads, the two men, quote, entered the house, opening and then locking the principal door. They walked through the ground level of the building, through the courtyard, portico, and loggia, touching the statues that remained inside as they passed. They ran their hands through the fresh grass and other plants of the courtyard. They climbed the staircase, opening and closing the windows and performing other acts of possession according to the custom of repossessing. This beautifully cinematic document from the State Archives in Florence provides us with important information to make sense of the complicated interlocking issues of access, authenticity, and the afterlife of models that were recast and reinterpreted by Florentine sculptors during the 17th and early 18th centuries. As this document makes clear, possession of models, especially those that materialized politically potent messages, were closely inventoried and tightly controlled by the Medici Grand Dukes, because within the court workshops, an artist did not control access to his own designs, but instead the Grand Dukes did. But this document is also important to frame the argument that I want to present today, which is about the powerful role that touch played in confirming authenticity. As I will demonstrate, like the hand of the agent that drew the models in the studio back into the Duke's possession, in the period, molds were believed to draw the model into its replica. So to make this argument, I'll begin with a brief overview of Giambologna's career in Florence and his utilization of the indirect casting process used to produce his designs, and then I'll take a focused look at how the models that were so central to the production of his fame passed from his private possessions to those of the Medici family, and finally I'll look at how the Medici's purchase of Giambologna's models after his death relate to other instances of political control of copies in the period. Giambologna, there he is, was a Flemish sculptor who stopped in Florence in the 1550s on his way back from Rome, where he had gone to study antique sculpture. Within a decade of his arrival, he was drawing a salary from the Medici court and eventually became Grand Ducal sculptor. He became known outside of Florence for his designs like the marble Florence triumphant over Pisa, created for the wedding of Francesco I di Medici and Joanna of Austria in 1565, or the Rape of the Sabines that was completed in 1582. By the 1580s, courts across Europe vied for the opportunity to commission Giambologna, but as a salaried member of the court, the Grand Duke decided for whom Giambologna could work and limited his movements outside of Florence. In order to allow Giambologna to focus on Medican projects while simultaneously responding to external patrons' desires for his designs, in the mid-1580s his workshop began to produce bronze statuettes made through the indirect casting process. This process allowed for Giambologna to create designs that could then be executed by his workshop. While obviously Giambologna was not the first to use this process of making, he and the Medici effectively utilized it in service of the court's diplomatic needs. During his life, patrons were aware of and recognized that Giambologna himself did not execute his designs, but instead his highly specialized workshop did. For example, a 1609 inventory clearly lists 10 statues as coming from Giambologna, meaning his designs vengono da Giambologna, but of the hand of Susini, or executed by his assistant Antonio Susini, in Italian del mano di Susini. This workshop was so effective that as Giambologna aged and even after his death, his workshop continued to produce objects that were understood to be by Giambologna. One such example is a gift of 15 statuettes that were sent to Prince Henry of Wales in 1611, 3 years after Giambologna's death. And this pacing stallion, as well as the 14 other bronzes sent to the prince, were understood to be Giambologna statuettes, although they were made by his assistant Pietro Tacca from molds made off of finished bronzes. While Giambologna's signature on a statuette is understood to indicate that it is an autograph work or one that he both designed and executed, in some cases his signature instead became an important trademark of authenticity rather than proof of his own involvement in the execution. For example, this bronze statuette of Ferdinando I on horseback, dated to around 1600, was signed. At a date this late in his career, it is more likely that the statuette was actually made by others in his workshop. His signature, therefore, was likely included because of the object's function as a diplomatic gift that coincided with the engagement of Maria de' Medici to Henry IV of France. And what this range of evidence demonstrates is that the early modern understanding of what a Giambologna statuette was dependent upon the bronze relationship to a design model by Giambologna's hands, but not necessarily his execution of it. Which raises a really interesting question in the context of this conference. If a Giambologna statuette did not necessarily need to be made by him in bronze to be understood as such, how do we understand those objects made after his lifetime and after his designs? About 100 individual statuette designs are attributed to Giambologna and his workshop. Of these designs, some were replicated more often than others, such as the Mars at the top, the sleeping nymph, or the bagpiper. There are, for example, over 30 versions of the Mars known. And the ubiquity of these designs contrasts with the small number of statuettes that are reduced versions of Giambologna's most well-known large-scale works for Florence's public squares. And in addition to the numerous complicated finished statuettes that we have to understand Giambologna's artistic practice, a number of his clay and wax models are still extant. And the existence of his models point not only to the central role they played in his sculptural practice, but more importantly, that people both within his period as well as after it saw these ephemeral objects as valuable enough to save. What comes from looking at this corpus as a whole, rather than the tangle of authorship round around individual statuettes, then, is that the definition of a Giambologna statuette in the early modern period came from how the court controlled his artistic production as well as his models. And the court's ability to do so after his death revolves around the Borgo Pinti workshops and the models it contained. Giambologna had purchased the Palazzo in Borgo Pinti in 1587. It was a purchase that reflected the artist's important status in the city. Shortly after, the Grand Duke Ferdinando I paid for the construction of a studio and a large casting furnace next to the Palazzo to facilitate the production of monumental equestrian statues. After the successful completion of the first monument, and quite possibly as a result of it, Giambologna was gifted ownership of the studio and furnace that had been constructed with Grand Ducal funds. When Giambologna died in 1608, his assistant Pietro Tacca was named Grand Ducal sculptor, and through Giambologna's will, Tacca was allowed to rent the palazzo, which comprised a living space and its furniture, from Giambologna's 10-year-old heir, Giovanni Dionisio Bologna. Tacca was also granted access to the casting furnace and the master sculptural models that were held in his studio. So there's Borgo Pinti again. The will emphasized, interestingly, that the models were to be used by Tacca and Giovanni together, thereby implying that Tacca could not use them alone. The posthumous inventory of Giambologna's property, drafted in 1608, notes that in the ground floor studio of the Palazzo, there were 16 large shelves of stucco models and 2 smaller shelves of wax models, and an even smaller shelf of small models of an unspecified material. To the disappointment of art historians, the inventory gives much more specification to the contents of boxes of clothes and linens, including, for example, used trousers of black cloth or 2 well-worn red shirts, than to the subjects and the state of these models that would become prized relics of Giambologna's artistic genius. A notable omission of Giambologna's post-mortem inventory is that it does not include the gesso models for large-scale sculpture that I referred to at the beginning of this paper, which were inventoried in 1687, still in the Borgo Pinti complex, and also referred to in the mid-18th century by Joshua Reynolds. A notable The absence of the large-scale models from the 1608 inventory may therefore suggest that they were never, in fact, Giambologna's property, unlike the small-scale models that clearly did belong to him. But we should pause to recall that even if he owned these models, during his life the production of them was completely controlled by the Medici because he was an employee of the court. While Giambologna had worked assiduously during his life to create both an artistic and familial legacy in Florence, in 1613 his heir renounced his Florentine title and sold the palazzo and furnace to the Grand Duke, Cosimo II. It was not until 1617 that the heir then decided to sell the studio and the wax models. As the document from the sale makes clear, the Grand Duke had the intention of buying the models from earlier on, and perhaps as early as the sale of the palazzo. Tacca clearly had an interest in the purchase as well, as he negotiated the sale and worked as the procurator. Cosimo II's purchase of the models implies that he had an awareness of the strategic value of owning Giambologna's models in order to continue the replication of his designs after his death. As I have already discussed, the master's models were particularly valued during his lifetime as they facilitated the fracture of bronze statuettes within his workshop. We must imagine, therefore, that if the Medici had not purchased Giambologna's models, they could have well left Florence and thus could have allowed someone outside of the Florentine workshop to reproduce them. And this would have been problematic for the Medici because Giambologna statuettes had become a particularly useful diplomatic tool, and it is clear that even after Giambologna's death, there was a continued demand for his statuettes. It is therefore highly possible that Tacca, in his role as Grand Ducal sculptor, encouraged Cosimo to purchase the models so that he would have access to them and permission to reproduce them. And this was not the first time that the Medici had used the simultaneously control of a prized model and the encouragement of its reproduction to their political advantage. They had done so, for example, through copies of Fra Filippo Lippi's 15th century Adoration of the Christ Child, as well as copies of the Annunciation fresco from the Church of the Santissima Annunziata in Florence. The Annunciation fresco, known in the period as L'Annunziata, was a powerful image in early modern Florence because it was believed to have been completed by an angel. While they were not the private owners of L'Annunziata, by the mid-15th century, the Medici had become the primary patrons of the image cult. In this role, they controlled public access to this powerful image and therefore its potential replication. In 1558, Duke Cosimo I de' Medici took even more pronounced ownership of L'Annunziata when he gained possession of the two keys that locked the shutters that concealed the fresco from sight. The keys, significantly, like Giambologna's models would later be, became part of the Medici's family's private possessions. While some copies of this fresco had been made in the 15th century, by the late 16th century, copies of L'Annunziata, like this one by Alessandro Allori, were marked by a new visual solimitude that was dependent upon access to the original. In the case of Allori's copy, he traced the composition of the holy image in order to make his copy, thus requiring that he touch his cartoon to the miraculous image himself. In the correspondence of the period, the cartoon is described as having a talismanic role of transferring the power of the original into the copy. When Allori's copy was sent to its recipient, the letter from the Grand Duke accompanied it to further underline its rarity and thus preciousness. Never has in any other time has a copy been drawn out of this painting, and drawn out is cavata. Allori's copy of L'Annunziata provides us with two important comparisons to further make sense of Cosimo's purchase of Giambologna's models in their period context. In both cases, the sequestration of the prized original served to increase its public value. And through this practice, the Medici were able to create a conceptual framework that described particular forms of copies as more legitimate. Material possession of a prized model therefore became a powerful tool used to form political allegiances because a copy or replica's authenticity and thus value relied on tactile access to the original. Certain originals, like L'Annunziata, were bound to a location and immobile. Its reproducibility was thus static, and this stasis was solidified by the means through which access to it was controlled. And while they could control Giambologna's models, the mobility of his statuettes themselves and the reproducibility afforded by the indirect casting process meant that if not regulated in other ways, they could be replicated outside of Medican authority. In these instances, relationships of trust were made to be the source of control. In 1609, the Grand Duke Cosimo II sent his cousin, Duke Francesco IV of Mantua, a crucifix, quote, by the hand of the deceased Giambologna. While it was a small gift, Cosimo hoped that Francesca would admire it not only for its religiosity, but also because of the fact that it was by such a rare maker. Cosimo stressed that due to the great prestige and regard his father held for this modello, he prayed that Francesca would not allow anyone to make a copy of it. Non lasciare anche cavare copia da nessuno. The use of the term modello in this context referred to what must have been a specific design for a crucifix created by Giambologna, which had been made in a limited number. Cosimo's use of the word cavare is especially important as it indicates not only that he did not want any copies made of it or literally drawn from it, but also emphasizes the particular kind of copy he was trying to prevent, one made from piece molds. It was therefore the processes of piece molding and indirect casting and their ability to create access to Giambologna that posed a threat to the Medici's control of his models after his death, although ironically, they were the same processes that were also the source of his continued utility to the court after his death. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ursel Berger. She was the director of the George Kolbe Museum for 35 years and is currently transforming the Kolbe estate into a museum for sculpture. She is a specialist in German and European sculpture for the end of the 19th to the mid-20th century and has worked on nearly 150 exhibitions on artists including Kolbe, Lembruck, and Aristide Maillol. And her talk today is on casts, posthumous casts of Maillol's work.
Thank you very much. Hello. After Giambologna, now Maillol, who also had a big afterlife. The increasing importance of distinguishing sculptures as made during the artist's life or posthumously leads to the following question. How can lifetime sculptures be identified? Some works have a clear pedigree, but a very great number of sculptures on the art market and in private or public collections require an expert report to determine their value. Who is an expert on a particular artist? Who is able to provide an expertise to give answers in which we can trust? Expert is not a clearly defined term. For an art historian, it is essential that scientific research cannot consist of repeating statements of others without checking up on them, even if they came from experts. For example, if you have a question concerning Rodin, you can consult many art history publications. You can visit the archive of the Rodin Museum to study the sources firsthand. You can ask specialists. However, if you have a question concerning Aristide Maillol, also an important French sculptor, you can't visit the archive of the Musée Maillol. I don't know anyone who has had free access to this archive. In the Musée Maillol's publications, you don't find evidence based on the scientific research. If you want to get an answer about the casting date of sculptures, you can find only expertises by the same people who produced, promoted, and sold most of these works. The question of posthumous casting was for a long time of little concern to collectors, art dealers, and art historians. And many artists failed to give a clear instructions concerning their estate. Also Maillol. Indeed, Maillol was not a man of the written word and did not make clear assertions about his work, contrary to Dina Vianney, who was the last model of the sculptor and became the heir of Maillol's son, Lucien Maillol, in 1972. She was the queen of the Maillol estate. Vianney gave the impression that Maillol had clear ideas about the management of his work and that she, and she alone, knew these rules. Vianney often made declarations and interpretations of Maillol's supposed aims. You will find these everywhere in catalogues of museums, exhibitions, and auctions. The fundamental text by Dina Vianney was published in an exhibition catalogue of 1958, an exhibition that started at the Rosenberg Gallery in New York and subsequently traveled to 10 American museums. In this catalogue, Dina Vianney published notes on the casting of Maillol's work. The essential sentences are as follows. The artist's editions are based on the principle of 6 copies for each original. If Maillol wanted to have more than 6 copies executed, he would make 2 plaster casts, one of which he gave to each of his founders, one for the cire perdue, the other for the sand casting. Every piece of Maillol's editions has on its base the artist's monogram and the founder's full signature. This signature defines the artistic guarantee and proof of the work's authenticity. So we now clearly understand how Dina Vianney declares Maillol practice. But what did Maillol say? The search for Maillol's own intentions is very difficult, but I managed to trace several of his declarations. Allow me to present you the cast of Flora. The German collectors Wolf bought a bronze of Flora in 1912. In 1930, they wanted to sell it and asked the artist about the edition. Here's Maillol's answer in his own handwriting and from the French transcription. Maillol assures that the statue was cast in an edition of 4 and that no other bronzes would be made. The state of Bavaria bought this figure for the Munich Museum, which is today in the Neue Pinakothek. An essential argument for the acquisition of this sculpture was the guarantee by the artist. In the last complete catalogue, the colleagues in Munich still believe that only 4 casts of this figure exist. However, this is not the case. There are more Floras posthumously cast. It is obvious that the Maillol estate didn't respect the guarantee made by the artist. For example, one of these bronzes is situated in the Musée Maillol. An American collector, Concha Goodyear, who became the first president of the MoMA, was interested in buying a bronze of this figure, Printemps, Spring. Maillol declined because the edition of 4 bronzes had already been sold. By the way, the beautiful statue in Munich is not numbered and has no foundry mark. If you look back to the assertions made by Dina Vianney, it is clear that in the case of Flora, like in many others, everything is wrong. Maillol didn't practice editions of 6. Maillol realized only 1 edition and not 2 or 3 or 4. Most of the bronzes cast in Maillol's time are not numbered. Often, Maillol bronzes are not marked by the foundry. The practices Dina Vianney wrote about are not the characteristic for bronzes of Maillol's lifetime. On the contrary, she described the characteristics which were typical for the posthumous castings made by her, by the estate. Surely, the so-called original pieces exhibited in 58 were posthumous casts made by her. They were authentic in Dina Vianney's point of view. Numbered bronzes, editions of 6, existed in 2 series made of 2 different foundries, and with foundry marks, I'm sure nearly all were posthumous cast. The next figure I'm presenting you illustrates how an original edition of 4 could multiply. The cyclist is an unusual but nevertheless very famous sculpture by Maillol. It was ordered in 1907 by Count Harry Kiesler, Maillol's most important patron. The model was a young man, a friend of Count Kiesler. Many notes and photographs by Kiesler document the development of this statue. Kiesler liked to have exclusive works by Maillol, unique casts. But after some discussion, Kiesler agreed that Maillol could reproduce 3 bronzes for his own use. And only the first one, which was Kiesler's piece, should be a cire perdu, a loose wax cast. These 4 original figures can be easily identified. Besides Kiesler's statue, now in the Kunstmuseum Basel, there are 2 more in German museums, one initially in the private Museum Volkwang, now in Essen, and one in the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. The 4th was first in a private collection and then bought by the French state in 1923, now Musée d'Orsay. In 1954, 10 years after Maillol's death, Dina Vianney offered the bronze of the cyclist to the Carlsberg Club to take in Copenhagen. In a letter dated of June 1954, she characterized the bronze as, quotation, one of the rarest pieces. There are 4 examples. I own the number 4, which is numbered and on the base. The 3 other examples, is quotation again, are in United States, Basel, and the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. This is the second column. You can clearly see that there is a problem. Dina Vianney didn't mention the 2 bronzes in German museums which existed already before the First World War and are still in the collections of the same museums. The bronze that Dina Vianney sold to Copenhagen was numbered 4 of 4. However, there undoubtedly were already 4 other pre-existing pieces, and Dina Vianney had claimed in her letter that there were only 4 casts. The solution of this problem can be found in the books of the famous Rudier foundry. There is documented that in 1951, 2 bronzes of the cyclist were cast. One was bought in 1952 by Kurt Valentin, an art dealer in New York. The other, Dina offered to Copenhagen. both are marked by Rudier. There is no doubt that both are posthumous bronzes. In 1963, the Folk Museum at Harvard University bought a bronze of the cyclist. It was the very piece that Kurt Valentin had bought from Lucien Maillol in 1952. Dina Vianney was asked for an expertise, but now, 9 years later, she told another story. Quotation from French: "The bronze you bought is part of an edition of, for example, which Alexis Rudier exclusively cast for Maillol. This bronze has been chiseled personally by Maillol. By the way, there exists a first edition of The Cyclist, limited to 4 exclusive examples, exclusive again, edited in 1907-08 by the Count Kiesler for his friends, made by a foundry no more known nowadays. I own a piece of the first edition, which I bought back from the old director of the Paris Opera. In any case, these first 4 bronzes are technically not well executed. That's the reason why Maillol wanted a second edition, a good one, made by Alexis Rudier. The figure sold to you has a direct provenance from the artist's studio. An incredible document, all is wrong. I don't want to list all the fibs and lies. The most important claim is that Maillol ordered a second edition of The Cyclist in the 1920s, cast by the Rudier foundry. But we know that Rudier cast the first figures of this statue in 1951. No Rudier bronze of The Cyclist existed before this time. Not on the art market, not in known private collection, in museums, in exhibitions. And the story that the first edition was bad and the Rudier bronze is good is also untrue. Here you can see a detail from the figure in Munich on the left, and the later Copenhagen bronze on the right. The latter, cast by Rudier, is not at all better than the earlier one that's visible in the modeling of the hair. In the second letter by Dina Vianney, it becomes even more clear that the Maillol estate sold the 2 first Rudier casts of 1951 as lifetime versions. One was even supposed to have been chiseled by Maillol himself years after he died. The 2 sculptures, Flora and Cyclist, are also suitable examples to illustrate another problem, an even greater problem: the sudden appearance of variations of Maillol's sculptures totally unknown before. For example, a sister to Flora and a brother to The Cyclist. Maillol often said that Flora was one of the few statues that he modeled very quickly. Because Flora is a clothed figure, Maillol didn't need as much time for the constructing of the architecture of the nude body. He did not require the reference of a model. He described this practice as faire du chic, making chic, modeling with concentration on a fluent surface. But astonishingly, in 1961, a nude Flora made its first appearance. It seems completely improbable that Maillol, in the short time he modeled the clothed Flora, also would have made a nude version, and it seems not so that no contemporary ever saw a nude version either. Obviously, it is difficult to prove that something didn't exist. But after more than 20 years of research on Maillol, I'm convinced that the sculptor never modeled a nude flora, a flora without flowers. Maillol, the master of the round sculptural body, is supposed to have made such a figure lacking harmony and with such a senseless gesture. Yet, nevertheless, one can find 4 bronzes of the nude flora in American museums. The making of the cyclist is extremely well documented. In the numerous photographs, one can see the sculpture in different unfinished states, but none of those torsos constitute a complete sculpture. This is a page of the book on Maillol by the art historian Bertrand Lorcain, a son of Gina Vianney, published in 1994. This book is an official publication of the Fondation Gina Vianney Musée Maillol. Here, the armless cyclist was pictured for the first time. For the Maillol estate, it is undoubtedly an original work by Maillol. In this case, it is not so difficult to prove that such a version didn't exist before, because in the letter that Gina Vianney wrote to Folk Museum in 1963, she highlighted the significance of the bronze with the following words: "No other state of the cyclist exists, no variant, and no preliminary sketch." In this case, the assertion made by Gina Vianney was correct. The cyclist was indeed made by Maillol only as a complete figure. For the principal aim of Gina Vianney to enlarge, or better to multiplicate the oeuvre of Maillol, the making of torsos was an ideal procedure. Oops. For example, here are 5 torsos of Venus, for all of which I couldn't find any trace as having been made in the lifetime of Maillol. Well, the subject of my lecture could go on forever. It's interesting. I want to add one more example, one of the most cherished small figures, Leda. Here is one of the first bronzes in the museum in Budapest before Maillol, before 1910. Maillol sold approximately 20 sculptures to the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, including the Leda. Maillol sold it, according to the contract, I quote, "with the right of edition and reproduction." I have studied these contracts, and I'm sure that Maillol kept to the agreement. But Gina Vianney often said that Maillol began to make own editions before World War I. This applies also the models he had sold to Vollard. Everybody believed this story, and so did I long ago. However, I didn't find any bronze of Leda from Maillol's lifetime that was not a Vollard cast. You see a list, you cannot read it, I think, compiled by an official French expert who used the preserved books of the Rudier Foundry. He listed all the Ledas that he found in this source. Unfortunately, none of the books predating 1926 have survived, but many other sources prove that there are no Ledas cast by Rudier in Maillol's time. Here, on the right, is a page from the Rudier books which with 2 Ledas cast in 53. Many bronzes marked Alexis Routier continue to appear on the art market, mostly presented as lifetime pieces and always without proof. For example, this Leda on the left, which was auctioned in Paris in 2014. It is marked by the Routier Foundry and was presented as a cast from an edition of 6 bronzes made in the 20s. Olivier Loquin, a son of Tina Vianney, provided the expertise. I assume that this figure which was cast in 2 pieces, fondu 2 pièces, is exactly that one, specified as Leda Socle Mobile. Here there are profound differences between the Routier books and the information provided by the Maillol estate. Routier produced the Leda not in an edition of 6, but at least of 26. And he cast them not in the 20s, but in the 40s until to the 70s, at least. This figure, must be this. The upgrading of Posthumous cast corresponds with the devaluation of historical bronzes from the Volar editions. These Volar figures, in reality the only legal versions, have been appraised by Vianney and Loquin as fakes, for example, the Leda in Budapest. The Maillol estate has made sure that such bronzes do not go on auctions. In the books, catalogues, exhibitions, and on the art market, there are mostly only new bronzes issued by the Maillol estate, often cast in their own foundry, sold by them, and expertised by them. This picture shows the gallerist Klaus Perls and Dina Vianney, both looking quite pleased after a shipment of new bronzes had arrived in New York in 1970. Attention, many of those mislabeled Maillols still are in the United States.
And our final speaker on this session is Jason McCoy. He is the president of Jason McCoy Gallery, as well as the estate of Frederick Kiesler. Established in 1982, his gallery was established in 1982. It's located in Manhattan. I'm sure many of you know it. And it represents a selection of artists' estate and an international group of contemporary artists working in painting, drawing, photography, video, sculpture, and installation. Jason McCoy has aided in the formation of the Austrian Frederick and Lillian Kiesler Private Foundation in Vienna in 1997, whose objective is to explore Kiesler's heritage and to ascribe it to the contemporary canon of architectural and artistic practices. And he is going to talk today about the realization of a particularly interesting project by Posthumously from Kiesler's work.
Thank you very much, and thank all of the organizers for this event. I was curiously first about why I was asked or joined participating in such an erudite company. I first met Lillian Kiesler, who inherited the Frederick Kiesler Foundation in the mid-1980s. And frankly, I hadn't heard of Frederick Kiesler until I met Lillian, that is. She was completely devoted to the work of her late husband, although they had been married only a couple of years when Frederick died in 1965. He had been born, or he was born in 1890. Frederick Kiesler is one of the most important, I think, conceptual artists, designers in the 20th century. His work is little known because it is so conceptual. It was difficult to find anything over an overview about Frederick Kiesler in the 1980s. The best known work he had done was for Peggy Guggenheim in creating the design of Art of the Century, which was a three-dimensional presentation of Peggy's collection of primarily surrealist paintings in 1945. Kiesler, however, was a prolific thinker and draftsman and conceptualist. He made dozens of drawings and studies for what became known as the endless house, which was a very unfashionable thing to be thinking of. Most people were thinking of Mies van der Rohe, and Kiesler thought of the endless house in the shape of an egg, without rooms defined at all. When Lillian died, I became aware of the problem of what to do with Frederick Kiesler's art and sculpture, including a work that was called Bucephalus. Here, this is a picture of Frederick Kiesler and a small version of the horse he called Bucephalus, and standing in front of the plaster model that was in process, also called Bucephalus, but unlike the little filly he's holding, the sculpture behind him was 27 feet long and 6.5 feet high. Whoops. My challenge on Lillian's death was when I realized that the plaster, Bucephalus, could no longer be left to its own in storage, a plaster that was ever more fragile, built on chicken wire. It either had to morph into an aluminum cast, which is what Kiesler had envisioned, or be lost. So it wasn't really even with a thought that it was a commercial undertaking. It was more a necessity from my point of view that this, the last and greatest concept of Kiesler, the conceptual artist, be made real. Quoting from Lillian Kiesler, the last 2 years of his life he designed Bucephalus, an environmental horse construction using wire mesh covered with cement. He created a horse belly that was an endless house, and he flung legs, head, tail into space. It is because of Lillian's devotion, love, and belief in Frederick Kiesler that his work has always been an inspiration for me. Over 40 years after Kiesler's conception of Bucephalus, the horse would be an embodiment of a grotto for meditation, as well as an environmental sculpture. To this end, Kiesler inscribed poetry on the interior belly walls and designed the space to be entered, for one to be embraced in the womb, to see magical drawings and to hear poetry spoken. So it is not only a static thing, but in a certain way, an endless house, replete with light and sound, appealing to all of the senses. It's because of Lillian's attention and dream that anything exists of Bucephalus. And it was really a response to my gift from Kiesler himself to see that the cast was made. Fortunately, it was under the auspices of Kiesler's original studio assistant, a man named Len Pitkowski, who by the time we were in 1990s was entering into his early 70s himself. But Len had made the sculpture along with Kiesler, had kept notes, and when I asked if he would oversee the completion, the casting, he happily agreed. And so I felt that it was a moral, it was the way that it not only justified, but Len's involvement with the foundry was what gave the right to the plaster to be completed in Kiesler's aluminum, which was his original vision. This is the plaster Bucephalus as photographed in Kiesler's studio before his death in 1965. This is Kiesler inside, in the belly of Bucephalus, which makes clear his concept that the sculpture was meant to be entered. It was a grotto for meditation. I guess we've finished meditating. Whoa. It's helpful to remember or to know that Kiesler was about 5 feet tall. So by the time he got up and down and inside this horse, it was really something. This is a photograph with Len Pitkowski and myself at the Pollux Foundry, and the process that it took to cast. It's an interior shot of the inside of Bucephalus. The gilding of the interior was accomplished, something I never would have dared even think about. But Len had notes, and it really is a fulfillment of Kiesler's original concept and design. So one could enter the belly of the horse, lie down and relax if you dared, and there was a recording that Kiesler had specified that was meant to be activated when one lay down on a horsehair mattress, also specified by Kiesler, and relaxed and envisioned horses' hooves, as it turns out, and read on the ceiling a poem that Kiesler had envisioned. There's a friend who was about 6 feet 2 inches tall inside Bucephalus. Gives you an idea of the scale. I think I guess my thought is that unlike so many other issues of posthumous casting, this one seems to me to have been necessitated to ensure that Kiesler's vision, his ultimate vision, his major contribution to the world of environment and art life spirituality be saved or cast. And had it not been posthumous, had Lillian not kept the bits and pieces of Kiesler's fragmented oeuvre together, this man who was never well known in his lifetime and only now is being understood how far ahead he was, not until Frank Gehry had a computer, really, were the concepts and ideas and thoughts and truly the genius of Frederick Kiesler, whose best friend actually was Duchamp, would they be held for posterity. So I'm very happy that I was able, caused to cast Bucephalus, although in the process of casting Bucephalus, we did lose the chicken wire and plaster armature, which Bucephalus now embodies. But thank you.
I just want to pose one question, and then we'll turn it out for questions from the floor. But in thinking about the particular role that casts can play in perpetuating an artist's body of work, one of the recurring themes, it seems to me, it raises is the essential tragedy of human mortality, that objects and artists eventually die. We aspire, though, they do, all of us on some level perhaps, aspire to live on. And so casts in particular can play an essential role in allowing that to happen while also exerting over time an influence and perhaps altering the notions of the artist's identity. And so I'm curious for each of you how you see that function of the cast as a form of immortalizing, but perhaps also for good or for bad or simply neutrally, having an influence on the artist's immortality in the sense of how we understand that person's artistic identity, aspirations, and values.
Hello? Hello?
You should be on.
Hello? Can you hear me? I think one of Freddie Kiesler's central ideas for his art and life was that death always signifies both beginnings and endings. And in this context, the sculpture Bucephalus is conceived as an environmental glorification of the concept of rebirth, and that includes meditation. And I think he was drawn to grottos and the idea of spirituality. It might help to point out for those of us who haven't read Plutarch that Bucephalus was Alexander the Great's horse. He was a battle stallion, and on his death in battle, he was immortalized by Alexander with a state funeral. And I think that everything about Kiesler is cyclic. It feeds on concepts, on old and new. Regeneration is one of them. But Bucephalus was the stallion that Alexander the Great rode for thousands of miles, and through many battles to create his mighty empire. The legend begins with Ballonets, a Thessalian, bringing a wild horse to Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. Philip was angry for bringing such an unstable horse to him, but Alexander had watched Bucephalus and set his father, Philip, a challenge. Although Alexander was only 12 years old, he had noticed that Bucephalus was shying away from his own shadow. Alexander gently led Bucephalus into the sun so that his shadow was behind him. Eventually, Bucephalus allowed Alexander to ride him, and much to the public humiliation of Philip, Philip gained face by commenting, look thee out of a kingdom equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee. Alexander named the horse Bucephalus because the head seemed as broad as a bull. Bucephalus died of battle wounds in 326 BC in Alexander's last battle. Alexander founded the city of Bucephala, thought to be the modern town of Yelam in Pakistan, in memory of his wonderful horse, and Kiesler in turn found Bucephalus as an inspiration for his own transcendence. Does that answer anything?
That's very rich. Anna, how do you want to address it?
So I guess this is something that I think a lot about, because my research is less about Giambologna than it is about his followers. And what's interesting is Giambologna becomes defined through this multiplicity of statuettes that are ascribed to his designs, but also his followers and his assistants always just get defined as the assistant to Giambologna in the titles of books and articles about them. So I mean, this process of casting and replicating that was so central to the production of Giambologna's fame during his lifetime, after his lifetime, kind of casts a shadow over the whole 17th century in Florence. Florentine sculptors kind of working in this tradition. So it's interesting how the casts of his designs, both during his lifetime, after, and up, through the 19th century as well, define what we think a Giambologna is, but also define everybody else's relationship in relation to him as the great master that everybody else just kind of lost it afterwards and couldn't do anything. So it's not just him that's defined through this practice, but a lot of other artists as well.
And Ursel,
Yes,
the
the work by Maillol is not a large one, and so it is understandable that there are made posthumous casts, even because he lived in that time with 2 world wars, but in reality the estate created a very different Maillol, which was not the real Maillol. For example, in making it as a master of torso, which is not at all correct. And some things more. Maillol looked for the best figure of his idea. And the estate cast first state, second state, and torso, and the fragments, and so. And Maillol never would push outside things which are not complete, finished.
Are there questions from the floor?
Hello? Okay. Hi, I'm Sharon Flesher. I'm Executive Director of IFAR, the International Foundation for Art Research. My question is for Ursel Berger. I thought your talk was absolutely fascinating, but I'm a little confused about something, so I'd just like to clarify, make sure I understood correctly. There's a difference between the ethical and legal and whatever issue about posthumous versus lifetime. But what you were, I think, implying, suggesting, or outrightly stating is that the Maillol estate and Dina Vierny, who I assume is dead by now, long since dead by now, are outright doing something outrightly fraudulent. Was I mishearing? Because this is an entire syndrome, if you will, of activities from lies, falsely authenticating and disauthenticating, and using their estate privileges, droit moral privileges, and copyright privileges, and everything else that France generously gives to artists and their families long after their death, to completely muddy the waters in the art world and the art market. I mean, and Maillol is a major artist. So did I mishear something, or is that what you're actually saying?
I think so. Yes. Yes. And surely it is not easy to prove all that, what I think. It is a great problem.
And so where does one go from here? I mean, what you're saying is something, I think, quite serious. I'm not challenging what you're saying. I'm in a way trusting what you're saying based on your years of research. But I think the implications are so great. So where does one go from there, both the museum world and the scholarly world and also the marketplace? So I leave that as a question because I was a little shocked to hear this talk. Impressed, but shocked.
I understand. Yes, surely this is a part of a very big, large research, and I could take only a few examples, and I want to show the real Maillol in the book I'm writing, which will be concentrated only on the lifetime works, sculptures, and there's many things which are on the market and in museums. They are not to find in this book. But it is such a difficult thing, so I'm careful.
As should all buyers be.
And
is
what
there
does
another
the
question?
estate say? And what does the, have you, if you're speaking in public here,
Yes.
what does the estate say about
Oh.
your challenges?
Dina said, the plus grand ennemi de Maillol. Dina said that I'm the biggest enemy of Maillol, because she thought that she is Maillol.
Is there another question, or?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Garay from the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute. Just to dovetail off of what Sharon has asked, now, Professor Berger, that your information is out in the open, particularly in New York during the art fairs and right before the auctions, for the public and collectors who have these Maillols and who are about to, or considering buying these Maillols, are you prepared to be put on the spot in a very public way? Because I'm sure that this talk is going to be publicized, and I'm just wondering if you're prepared to go up against the Lorcans in that respect.
I published these things long ago in German. Nobody knows it. But Dina Vianney and her sons knows it. They read German, and so I'm well prepared. Yes, but it's a fight.
Just a footnote, really, on the same line. Do you think in the end the problem is us, that the public is too gullible? We believe too much too quickly.
Yes, yes. And yes, somebody did know Dina Vianney, I believe. She was an interesting person, and she pretended that she knows all. And she fought against opinions which are suitable with hers. Their books could not appear, but the rights are finished, and so it will be changed. Yeah. So 70 years after the death.
I think we could maybe sum this up in part by simply saying, acknowledging that perhaps the truest form of immortality for an artist or an object is that it remains part of a conversation. And that conversation is going to lead in many ways, in many directions, and be nurtured by, we hope, scholarship, by response from an audience, and from conferences like this. So thank you very much. I think we're heading off to lunch now, and see you back in the afternoon.